Sometimes the most broken people find each other in the most desperate places. Sometimes a woman with nothing left to lose meets a man who's forgotten how to love anything but his land. In Coyote Gulch, Cassian Holt ran his ranch like a king runs his kingdom. This giant cowboy believed a man's worth came from the sons he left behind. When 21-year-old Mariah June arrived at his door, hungry and alone after losing everything in a barn fire, Cassian saw his chance. He wanted 3 strong boys to carry on his name, and he wanted them starting tonight. But Mariah wasn't the scared girl he expected. She had fire in her heart and steel in her spine. What happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object? What happens when a man used to taking what he wants meets a woman who refuses to be taken? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust of Coyote Gulch settled on everything like a shroud of forgotten dreams. In this corner of the Wyoming Territory, where the wind carved stories into sandstone cliffs and the sun baked hope from men's hearts, survival belonged to those willing to take it by force. The town itself was little more than a collection of weathered buildings huddled together against the vast emptiness general store, a saloon, a church that saw more funerals than weddings, and a handful of houses where families clung to the notion that civilization could take root in such unforgiving soil. But 5 miles west of town, where the grassland stretched toward distant mountains like a green ocean, frozen in time, stood the Holt Ranch. It was an empire carved from wilderness by the iron will of one man, a testament to what determination and ruthlessness could accomplish when applied with unwavering purpose. Cassian Holt had built his kingdom with calloused hands and a heart hardened by betrayal. At 35, he stood 6 feet and 4 inches in his boots, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of his ambitions and hands large enough to span a horse's neck. His face bore the weathered lines of a man who had stared down storms, both natural and human, with eyes the color of winter sky-cold, clear and unforgiving. A scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, a permanent reminder of the night his first wife had tried to kill him in his sleep before running off with his foreman and half his cattle. That had been 7 years ago, and in those 7 years, Cassian had rebuilt everything she had tried to destroy. The Holt Ranch now sprawled across 15,000 acres of prime grazing land, home to 3,000 head of cattle and 50 of the finest horses in the territory. The ranch house itself was a monument to his success-story stories of solid timber and stone, with a wraparound porch that offered commanding views of his domain. Inside, heavy furniture spoke of permanence and prosperity, while mounted heads of elk and bear testified to his prowess with a rifle. But for all his material success, Cassian Holt remained a man haunted by absence. The rooms of his grand house echoed with emptiness, and at night, when the work was done and the cattle settled, he would sit on his porch with a glass of whiskey and stare at the horizon, thinking of the sons he should have had by now, boys who would carry his name and continue what he had built after the earth claimed him. His ranch hands respected him, but they also feared him. There was Jake Morrison, his foreman, grizzled man of 50, who had ridden for Cassian since the early days and knew better than most when to speak and when to keep silent. There was young Tommy Briggs, barely 18 but handy with horses and eager to prove himself worthy of the Holt brand. And there were a dozen others, drifters and cowboys, who stayed because Cassian paid fair wages and asked only for loyalty and hard work in return. The people of Coyote Gulch knew Cassian as a man who kept his word, whether it was a promise or a threat. When drought had struck 3 summers past, he had opened his wells to his neighbors without charge. When rustlers had plagued the valley, he had organized the ranchers into a fighting force that had driven the thieves clear into Colorado. But they also knew he was not a man to cross he's. Justice was swift and absolute, and his memory for wrongs committed against him was longer than winter nights. It was on a Tuesday morning in late September, when the aspen trees were turning gold and the air carried the first bite of coming winter, that Maria June stumbled into Cassian Holt's world. She had been walking for 3 days, following the dusty road that connected the scattered settlements of the territory like a thread stringing together lonely beads. Her shoes, what remained of them, had given up their battle against the rough ground miles ago, leaving her feet wrapped in strips torn from her petticoat. The dress she wore had once been blue calico, but now it was the color of dust and desperation, patched and repatched, until it resembled a quilt made from misfortune. Maria June Whitmore was 21 years old, though the hardships of the past months had carved years into her face. Her hair, the color of autumn oak leaves, hung in a braid down her back, and her eyes green as spring grass held a depth that spoke of sorrows beyond her years. She had been beautiful once, in the way that prairie flowers were beautiful, delicate and bright, and seemingly fragile. But like those same flowers, she had learned to sink deep roots and bend with the wind rather than break. The barn fire that had taken everything had happened on a night when the wind screamed across the Kansas plains like a banshee. Her father's small farm, 20 acres of struggling wheat and a handful of chicken shad, been their whole world. When lightning struck the barn, the flames had spread faster than prayer could travel. Her father had died trying to save their 2 milk cows, and her mother had followed him 3 days later, her heart simply giving up under the weight of loss. Maria had buried them both in the little cemetery behind the Methodist church, sold what remained of their possessions to pay the debts her father had hidden from her, and set out for the Wyoming Territory, where her mother's sister was said to live. She had 57 cents in her pocket, a letter of introduction that might or might not reach the right hands, and the desperate hope that family blood still meant something in a world that seemed determined to grind the weak into dust. She had walked, ridden in the back of supply wagons when sympathetic drivers took pity on her, and slept under more stars than she had ever imagined existed. The nights were the hardest when the sounds of the wilderness surrounded her, and she had nothing but memories for company. But each morning she had risen and continued west, driven by the stubborn belief that somewhere ahead lay a chance for something better than mere survival. When she crested the hill overlooking the Holt Ranch, Maria felt her heart skip despite her exhaustion. The house stood proud and strong against the morning sky, smoke rising from its chimney like a promise of warmth. The corrals held horses that gleamed in the sunshine, and the cattle dotting the pastures represented wealth beyond anything she had ever imagined. This was what success looked like in the territory's not just survival, but triumph over the wilderness itself. She had not intended to stop. Her destination was still Coyote Gulch, where she hoped to find word of her aunt's whereabouts. But her legs chose that moment to remind her of their exhaustion, and she stumbled, catching herself against a fence post as the world swayed around her. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up, and she found herself staring at the largest man she had ever seen. Cassian Holt sat his black stallion like a king surveying his realm. Even mounted, his presence filled the landscape, and when his winter-cold eyes fixed on her, Maria felt something shift in the air between thema recognition that neither understood but both felt in their bones. He dismounted with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to command, and when he approached her, she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. "You lost, girl." His voice was like distant thunder, low and powerful, and carrying the promise of storms. Maria straightened her spine, calling on reserves of pride she hadn't known she still possessed. "Not lost, sir. Just passing through on my way to town." Cassian's eyes took in her torn dress, her wrapped feet, the hollows beneath her cheekbones that spoke of too many missed meals. But he also noticed the way she held herself straight and dignified, despite her circumstances, with a spark in her green eyes that reminded him of unbroken horses. "When's the last time you ate?" he asked, and the question was more command than inquiry. "I'm fine, thank you." The lie came automatically, a defense born from pride and necessity. Cassian studied her for a long moment, seeing past the words to the truth they tried to hide. This girl-woman, he corrected himself, noting the mature lines of her figure despite her youth, was on the edge of collapse, but she faced him with the same courage he had seen in cornered wildcats. There was something about her that caught his attention, like a burr catches fabric, something that made him think of the sons he needed and the legacy he was determined to build. "My ranch," he said, gesturing toward the house with one massive hand. "My rules. And my first rule is that nobody goes hungry on Holtland. You'll come up to the house, get yourself fed and cleaned up." It was not a request, and Mariah recognized the tone of absolute authority. But rather than shrink from it, she felt an unexpected stirring of defiance. She had been making her own decisions since she was 16 years old, and she had survived horrors that would have broken weaker souls. She would not be ordered about like a child or a servant, no matter how desperate her circumstances. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Bland. Holt. Cassian Holt. Mr. Holt, but I don't take charity." Something that might have been amusement flickered in Cassian's cold eyes. "Not charity, investment. You look like you know your way around hard work, and I've got more work than men to do it. You clean up well enough, you might find a place here." The offer hung in the air between them like smoke, carrying implications that neither spoke aloud. Mariah felt the weight of his gaze, the way his eyes lingered on the curve of her waist, the line of her throat. She was not naive-ish. She understood what men like Cassian Holt expected from women like her. But she also understood that choices were luxuries she could no longer afford. "What kind of work?" she asked, and her voice was steady, despite the rapid beating of her heart. "The kind that pays wages and puts a roof over your head," Cassian replied. Then, with the certainty of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, he added, "The kind that might lead to more, for the right woman." The words carried weight beyond their surface meaning, and Mariah felt something cold settle in her stomach. But alongside the fear was something else, recognition that this man, for all his obvious power and barely restrained wildness, was offering her what she needed most. A chance to survive in a world that had already taken everything she had ever loved. "I'll work for fair wages," she said finally. "Nothing more, nothing less." Cassian's smile was slow and dangerous, like sunrise over a battlefield. "We'll see about that, Miss June. Mariah June. Miss June." He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was part courtesy, part claiming. "Welcome to the Holt Ranch." As he helped her up onto his horse behind him, Mariah felt the solid warmth of his back against her chest and wondered if she had just made the best decision of her life, signed her own death warrant. Either way, she was no longer walking alone on an empty road, and for now, that had to be enough. The house loomed larger as they approached, its windows reflecting the morning sun like watching eyes. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a voice whispered that she had just crossed a threshold from which there might be no return. The bath water was the first hot water Mariah had felt against her skin in weeks, and she sank into it with a sigh that came from her very soul. Mrs. Braces Henderson, Cassian's housekeeper, stern woman of 50 with kind eyes and work-worn handshad, provided soap that smelled of lavender and a clean dress that had belonged to some previous woman of the house. Mariah didn't ask about its former owner, and Mrs. Henderson didn't volunteer the information. "Your skin and bones, child." Mrs. Henderson clucked as she set out towels. "Haven't seen ribs showing through a woman's back like that since the hard winter of '72. Mr. Holt's got beef aplenty, we'll get some meat back on you proper." Mariah's reflection in the washstand mirror showed a stranger hollow, cheeked and sharp-angled, where she had once been soft and rounded. At 21, she should have been in the bloom of womanhood, but hardship had carved away everything that wasn't essential for survival. Still, beneath the weariness, she could see hints of who she had been before the fire stole her world. The dress Mrs. Henderson had brought was blue wool, well-made and clearly expensive. It fit her slight frame well enough, though it hung loose where curves should have been. As she braided her damp hair, Mariah wondered about the woman who had worn this dress before Herond, what had become of her. When she descended the main staircase an hour later, she found Cassian waiting in what was clearly his study. The room spoke of wealth and education. Leather-bound books lined the walls, and a massive desk dominated the space like an altar to commerce and power. Behind the desk hung a portrait of a stern-faced man who shared Cassian's strong jaw and piercing Aisha's father, most likely the one who had started building this empire. Cassian himself stood with his back to her, staring out the window at his domain. He had changed from his riding clothes into dark trousers and a white shirt that stretched across his broad shoulders. When he turned to face her, Mariah saw something shift in his expression, a momentary softening that was quickly replaced by his usual mask of control. "Better," he said, his voice carrying approval that made her spine stiffen with unexpected pride. "Mrs. Henderson's been feeding you?" "Yes, sir, thank you." "Sit." He gestured to a chair across from his desk, and Mariah settled herself carefully, aware of his eyes following her every movement. "We need to discuss your situation." The formality of his tone put her on guard. "My situation?" Cassian moved around his desk with the deliberate pace of a man accustomed to dramatic effect. When he sat, the chair creaked under his weight, and Mariah found herself trapped by the intensity of his gaze. "You're 21 years old, traveling alone, with nothing but the clothes on your back. No family to speak of, no prospects, no protection. In this territory, that's not just unfortunate, it's dangerous." Heat rose in Mariah's cheeks. "I can take care of myself." "Can you?" The question was soft, but carried the weight of a challenge. "You were half dead when I found you this morning. Another day on that road, and the vultures would have been picking your bones clean." The brutal honesty of his words hit her like a physical blow, but Mariah forced herself to meet his stare. "I'm stronger than I look. Strength won't stop a bullet or a knife in the dark, won't stop men who see a pretty young woman traveling alone and decide to take what they want." His voice dropped lower, more intimate. "This isn't Kansas farmland, Miss June. This is frontier territory, where the law is what a man can enforce with his own two hands." Mariah's throat felt dry. "What are you suggesting?" Cassian leaned back in his chair, studying her with the same intensity he might use to evaluate prime breeding stock. "I'm suggesting a practical arrangement, marriage." The word hit the air between them like a thunderclap, and Mariah felt the world tilt on its axis. "Marriage. A business transaction," Cassian continued, his tone matter-of-fact. "You need protection, security, a place in this world. I need sons to carry on my name and inherit what I've built. We can provide each other with what we lack." Mariah's hands clenched in her lap. "You don't even know me." "I know enough." He stood and moved to the window again, presenting her with his broad back. "You're young, healthy, intelligent enough to survive on your own for weeks. You're not afraid of hard work, and you don't break easily under pressure. Those are the qualities I need in the mother of my children." The casual way he discussed her like livestock made anger flare in Mariah's chest. "And what if I refuse?" Cassian turned, and something dangerous flickered in his winter-pale eyes. "Then you're welcome to continue on to town, but understand this, once you leave my protection, you're on your own. And a woman alone in Coyote Gulch doesn't stay alone for long." The threat was softly spoken but absolute, and Mariah felt the walls of the room closing in around her. "You're saying I have no choice?" "You always have a choice." He moved closer, and she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. "But some choices are better than others. I'm offering you comfort, security, and purpose. Your children, our children, would want for nothing. They would inherit an empire. And what would you expect from me?" Cassian's smile was slow and predatory. 3 strong sons to carry on the Holt name, starting tonight." The words hung in the air like smoke from a branding iron, marking this moment as a point of no return. Mariah felt her heart hammering against her ribs as the full implications of his proposal settled over her. This wasn't a courtship, or even a marriage in any traditional sense. It was a breeding arrangement, cold and calculated, and devoid of any pretense of love. "You're talking about purchasing me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm talking about survival." Cassian's tone remained maddeningly calm. "Yours and mine." I need heirs, and I need them from a woman who won't betray me or abandon them when the going gets rough. You need a roof over your head and food in your belly. It's not romantic, but it's honest. Mariah rose from her chair, needing to put distance between them. Her mother's wedding ring, hidden in a small pocket sewn into her undergarments, seemed to burn against her skeena, reminder of what marriage was supposed to be. Love, partnership, mutual devotion. Not this cold negotiation of needs and expectations. "And if I can't give you sons?" she asked, turning to face him. "If I prove barren or bear only daughters?" Something cold and final passed over Cassian's features. "Then you'll have failed in your primary purpose, but that's a risk I'm willing to take." The brutal honesty of his answer made Mariah's knees weak. This man would discard her as easily as he might discard a broken tool if she failed to serve his purposes. But even as fear coursed through her veins, another part of her, the part that had survived the fire and the long journey west, began to calculate possibilities. "What exactly would be expected of me?" she asked, forcing her voice to remain steady. "You'd be mistress of this house, with all the authority that position entails. You'd oversee the household staff, manage the domestic affairs of the ranch, and represent the Holt name in social situations. And you'd share my bed until you've given me the sons I require." The casual way he spoke of such intimate matters made heat flood Mariah's face. She had been kissed exactly twice in her 21 years, once by the blacksmith's son back in Kansas, and once by a traveling preacher who had been less holy than he pretended. The thought of sharing a bed with this giant of a man, of allowing him the liberties that marriage would give him, made her stomach flutter with something that might have been fear or anticipation. "I would need time to consider." "No," the word was final, absolute. "I'm not a patient man, Miss June, and opportunities like this don't wait for comfortable timing. You'll give me your answer now." The ultimatum hung between them like a drawn blade. Mariah looked around the rich study, thinking of the warmth and security it represented, then thought of the cold road stretching toward an uncertain future. Her aunt might not even exist anymore. The letter she carried was 3 years old, and people died easily in the territories. Even if she found family in Coyote Gulch, what then? A life of dependence, of charity, of always being the poor relation who brought nothing but her troubles. "If I agree," she said slowly, "would you be faithful to me?" Cassian's eyebrows rose slightly. "You're in no position to make demands." "It's not a demand. It's a question." He studied her for a long moment, as if seeing something he hadn't expected. "I have no interest in maintaining a mistress or visiting the saloon girls. If you fulfill your obligations, I'll fulfill mine." It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was more than many frontier wives could expect. Mariah felt the weight of her mother's ring against her skin and made her choice with the same desperate courage that had carried her across 3 states. 3 months, she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "Give me 3 months to prove myself worthy of your name. If at the end of that time you're satisfied with my performance as your wife, then we'll discuss children." Cassian's eyes narrowed. "You're hardly in a position to negotiate terms." "I'm not negotiating. I'm offering you a trial period to ensure we're both satisfied with the arrangement before bringing children into it." Mariah lifted her chin, channeling every ounce of dignity she possessed. "Surely a businessman of your stature understands the value of testing a partnership before making it permanent." For a moment, she thought he would refuse Sis. Jaw tightened and something dangerous flashed in his eyes. But then, unexpectedly, he smiled. It was a predator's smile, full of teeth and dark promise. "Very well, 3 months. But understand this, Miss June, you'll be my wife in every sense of the word from tonight forward. The only thing I'm agreeing to postpone is getting you with child." The heat in his voice made Mariah's pulse race, but she forced herself to nod. "I understand." "Then we have an agreement." Cassian moved closer, until she could feel the heat radiating from his large frame. "The preacher will be here within the hour. Mrs. Henderson has already begun preparing the evening meal. We'll be married before sunset, and tonight You'll learn exactly what it means to be Mrs. Cassian Holt." As if summoned by his words, Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway. "The preacher's here, Mr. Holt, and I've set out your mother's wedding dress. It should fit the girl well enough with a few pins." Mariah felt the world spinning around her as the reality of what she had agreed to settled over her like a heavy cloak. In less than an hour, she would be married to a man she had met that morning, a man who saw her as nothing more than a vessel for his ambitions. But as Cassian's large hand settled on the small of her back, guiding her toward the door and her waiting future, Mariah felt something unexpected stir in her chest. Not love that would be foolish beyond measure, but something else, something that might have been anticipation for the challenge ahead. She had survived the fire that destroyed her world. She had walked across 3 states with nothing but determination and hope. She could survive Cassian Holt, too. And perhaps, in time, she might even find a way to make him realize that strength came in forms he had never imagined. The ceremony had been brief and businesslike, conducted in Cassian's study with Mrs. Henderson and Jake Morrison as witnesses. The preacher, a nervous man named Reverend Walsh, had hurried through the vows as if afraid that too much contemplation might change someone's mind. When Cassian kissed her to seal their union, his lips had been warm but impersonals, the kiss of a man claiming property rather than expressing affection. Now, 3 days into her marriage, Mariah found herself learning the rhythms of ranch life with the same determination that had carried her across the frontier. She rose before dawn to help Mrs. Henderson with breakfast preparations, her hands quickly remembering the domestic skills her mother had taught her. The kitchen was a warm haven filled with the sense of fresh bread and coffee, and she found unexpected comfort in the familiar routines of cooking and cleaning. But it was outside the house that Mariah truly began to understand the scope of Cassian's empire. The Holt Ranch operated like a small town, with its own blacksmith shop, bunkhouse, and even a one-room schoolhouse that had been built for children who had never materialized. Dozens of men worked the vast property, their days beginning before sunrise and ending well after sunset. "Ranch don't sleep," Jake Morrison had explained to her that first morning as he showed her around the property. The grizzled foreman had been initially skeptical of Cassian's sudden marriage, but his manner toward her had warmed when she proved she wasn't afraid of honest work. Cattle need tending, horses need training, and there's always something that needs fixing or building or moving. Mariah had thrown herself into learning every aspect of the operation. She memorized the names of the key hands, learned to distinguish between different breeds of cattle, and began to understand the complex logistics of managing such a vast enterprise. Cassian watched her efforts with what might have been approval, though his expressions remained largely unreadable. It was on her 4th morning as Mrs. Holt that Mariah discovered the workshop behind the main barn. The building was small and neat, filled with hand tools and half-finished projects that spoke of craftsmanship rather than mere utility. Wooden furniture in various stages of completion lined the walls, and the air smelled of cedar shavings and linseed oil. She was examining a beautifully carved chair back when footsteps in the doorway made her turn. Cassian filled the entrance, his massive frame backlit by the morning sun. In his hands, he carried what appeared to be a wooden comb, its handle intricately carved with a pattern of leaves and vines. "You're up early," he said, stepping into the workshop. "I wanted to see all of the ranch," Mariah replied, gesturing to the furniture around them. "Did you make these?" Something that might have been embarrassment flickered across Cassian's features. Winter work keeps the hands busy when the weather's too rough for outdoor labor. But Mariah could see the lie in the precise joinery and elegant proportions of the pieces. This wasn't mere busy work, this was the product of skill and artistry. "They're beautiful," she said sincerely. "My father used to carve a little, but nothing like this." Cassian's expression softened slightly. He approached her, holding out the comb he carried. "Made this for you? Figured you might need something proper for your hair." The comb was exquisite, carved from what appeared to be cherry wood and polished to a warm glow. The handle bore the same leaf pattern she had noticed on the chair, executed with a delicacy that seemed impossible from hands as large as Cassian's. As she accepted it, their fingers brushed, and she felt an unexpected jolt of awareness. "It's lovely," she said, running her thumb over the smooth wood. "Thank you. Hair like yours deserves better than the broken thing you've been using," Cassian said gruffly, as if embarrassed by his own gesture. The compliment, unexpected and genuine, brought warmth to Mariah's cheeks. In the days since their marriage, their interactions had been polite but distant, careful negotiations around shared meals and household matters. This glimpse of thoughtfulness beneath his stern exterior surprised her. "I should check on the horses," Cassian said, already moving toward the door. "Jake wants to show you the ledgers this afternoon. You'll need to understand the books if you're going to be managing household expenses." After he left, Mariah stood in the workshop for several minutes, turning the comb over in her hands. The gesture, small as it was, suggested depths to Cassian that his harsh exterior didn't reveal. Perhaps there was more to this arrangement than cold business after all. The afternoon brought her first real test as mistress of the ranch. She was reviewing household accounts with Mrs. Henderson when the sound of galloping horses drew them to the window. A group of riders approached the house. Their leader, a man she didn't recognize, tall and lean with dark hair and expensive clothes that marked him as someone of importance. "That's Marcus Steele," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice tight with disapproval. "Owns the spread to the south. Bad blood between him and Mr. Holt goes back years." Mariah watched as Cassian emerged from the barn to meet the riders, his posture tense and ready for trouble. Even from a distance, she could see the barely controlled aggression in both men's bearing. "What kind of bad blood?" she asked. "Water rights, mostly. Steele's been trying to buy up smaller ranches in the valley, consolidate his holdings. He's made offers for this place more than once, and Mr. Holt's made it clear the ranch isn't for sale at any price." Through the window, Mariah could see the conversation growing heated. Marcus Steele was gesturing angrily, while Cassian stood like a mountain, immovable and threatening. When Steele wheeled his horse around and rode off with his men, the tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Cassian's mood, when he came inside for dinner, was black as a thundercloud. He ate in silence, his jaw tight and his eyes distant. Mariah sensed that questions would not be welcome, but the worry in his expression stirred something protective in her chest. "Is there anything I can do to help?" she asked quietly. Cassian looked up, surprise flickering across his features. "Help with what?" "Whatever's troubling you. I may be new here, but I'm your wife now. Your troubles are mine." For a moment, something vulnerable passed over his face, so quickly she might have imagined it. Then his walls slammed back into place. "Steele's pressing harder about the water rights," he said finally. "Claims the drought gives him legal grounds to access our streams. It's nonsense, but he's got lawyers now, and lawyers can make nonsense sound like law." Mariah set down her fork, studying his face. "What does he really want?" "My land. All of it." Cassian's voice was flat with certainty. "He wants to control the entire valley, and the Holt Ranch is the biggest obstacle to that plan. Then we'll have to make sure he doesn't get it." The simple statement seemed to surprise him. "We? I told you your troubles are mine now." Mariah met his gaze steadily. "I may not know much about water rights or cattle ranching, but I know something about fighting for what's yours. I didn't survive everything I've been through just to lose the first real home I've had since my parents died." Something shifted in Cassian's expression, a recognition that hadn't been there before. "You consider this home?" The question was quietly asked, but Mariah sensed its importance. "I'm beginning to," she said honestly. "This place, these people, they're worth protecting." Cassian nodded slowly, as if her words had settled something in his mind. "Steele won't give up easily. He's the kind of man who takes what he wants, and he's wanted this ranch for a long time. Then he'll have to go through both of us." That night, as Mariah brushed her hair with the comb Cassian had made her, she reflected on how much had changed in just a few days. She was no longer the desperate girl who had stumbled onto the ranch seeking shelter. She was Mrs. Cassian Holt, with responsibilities and purpose that went beyond mere survival. When Cassian joined her in their bedroom arrangement, they had navigated with careful politeness since their wedding night. She saw him notice her using his gift. The small smile that touched his lips made her heart flutter in ways she wasn't ready to examine. "Suits you," he said simply, beginning to unbutton his shirt. "Thank you for the comb and for showing me the workshop today." Cassian paused in his undressing, studying her reflection in the mirror. "You really meant what you said at dinner, about this being your home?" Mariah turned to face him directly. "I meant it. This place is worth defending, Cassian. And so are you." The words hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. For a moment, Mariah thought he might say something that would acknowledge the connection growing between them, despite the practical nature of their union. But instead, he simply nodded and continued preparing for bed. As they settled into the large bed with careful space between them, Mariah found herself thinking about Marcus Steele and the threat he represented. She had lost one home to fire, and chances would not lose another to greed and intimidation. Whatever came next, she would face it as Mrs. Cassian Holt, with all the strength and determination that title demanded. Outside, the wind whispered across the prairie, carrying with it the promise of challenges yet to come. But inside the solid walls of the ranch house, Mariah felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the security of belonging somewhere worth defending. 2 weeks into her marriage, Mariah discovered that she possessed a talent for organization that even surprised her. The ranch ledgers, which had been kept in Jake Morrison's cramped handwriting and Cassian's bold scrawl, began to show her careful notations and systematic improvements. She reorganized the supply schedules, identified inefficiencies in feed distribution, and even suggested changes to the rotation of pastures that could increase their carrying capacity. Girls got a head for numbers. Jake admitted to Cassian one evening, not knowing that Mariah could hear them from the kitchen doorway. Sharp as a tack, and she sees connections the rest of us miss. Cassian's response was a non-committal grunt, but Mariah caught the note of satisfaction in it. Her contributions were being noticed and valued, which stirred a pride she hadn't felt since her father had praised her help with the farm's bookkeeping years ago. The leather-bound journal she had begun keeping was hidden beneath her undergarments in the bedroom dresser. Each night, she recorded her observations about ranch operations, her growing understanding of the land and its rhythms, and her increasingly complex feelings about the man she had married. The journal had become her confidant, the only place where she could be completely honest about her situation. October 15th, Cassian watched me work with the account books today. I caught him looking at me differently, as if he's beginning to see me as more than just a vessel for his ambitions. There are moments when his guard drops, when I glimpse the man beneath the harsh exterior. Yesterday, he helped me down from the wagon when we returned from town, and his hands lingered at my waist longer than necessary. I find myself thinking about those moments more than I should. The trip to Coyote Gulch had been her first public appearance as Mrs. Holt, and Mariah had been surprised by the mixture of respect and curiosity she encountered. The townspeople knew Cassian as a powerful man, and his sudden marriage had become the subject of considerable speculation. Some of the women had been openly suspicious, wondering what a young woman like her could possibly see in a man with Cassian's reputation. But others had welcomed her warmly, particularly Mrs. Abernathy from the general store, who had known Mariah's aunt. Sarah Whitmore died last winter. Mrs. Abernathy had informed her gently. Influenza took her quick and quiet. She spoke of you often, though said her sister had a girl back in Kansas who was smart as a whip. The news had been a blow, cutting off Mariah's last connection to family, but it had also confirmed that her decision to accept Cassian's proposal had been the right one. Without her aunt, she would have been truly alone in the territory, vulnerable to any man who decided to take advantage of her situation. "You did well in town," Cassian had said on the ride home. "The other women respect you already. That matters more than you might think." "Because their husbands will follow their lead?" "Because their husbands do business with me, and a man's wife can make his life pleasant or miserable depending on her opinion of his associates." Cassian had glanced at her sideways. You understand the game better than most." The compliment had warmed her more than it should have. Cassian's approval was becoming important to her in ways that both thrilled and frightened her. She was beginning to care what he thought, to want his respect and recognition. It was dangerous territory for a woman in her position. That afternoon brought unexpected visitors in the form of the Brennan family from the neighboring ranch to the east. Thomas Brennan was a weathered man in his 50s, with kind eyes and work-worn hands, while his wife Margaret was a plump, motherly woman who immediately took Mariah under her wing. Their son, David, a young man of perhaps 25 with sandy hair and an easy smile, paid particular attention to the new Mrs. Holt. "Pleasure to meet you, ma'am," David said, taking her hand and holding it perhaps a moment longer than propriety dictated. "Cassian's a lucky man to have found someone as lovely as yourself." The compliment was innocent enough, but Mariah noticed the way Cassian's jaw tightened at the younger man's words. When David offered to show her the ranch's prize horses, Cassian inserted himself into the conversation with the subtle menace of a mountain cat protecting its territory. "My wife has plenty to learn about our own stock before she needs to see anyone else's," he said, his voice carrying unmistakable warning. The display of possessiveness should have annoyed her after all. She was perfectly capable of managing a simple conversation with a neighbor. But instead, Mariah found herself oddly pleased by the evidence that Cassian considered her worth protecting. It suggested that their marriage was becoming more than just a business arrangement in his mind, even if he wasn't ready to admit it. That evening, as they prepared for bed, the tension from David Brennan's visit lingered in the air between them. "He was just being friendly," Mariah said as she brushed her hair with the comb Cassian had made. "Men like Brennan's boy are never just being friendly with married women." Cassian replied, his voice rough with something that might have been jealousy, especially not when those women are young and beautiful. The words, young and beautiful, hung in the air, and Mariah felt heat rise in her cheeks. In all their careful interactions, Cassian had never directly commented on her appearance beyond practical observations about her health and fitness. "You think I'm beautiful?" she asked quietly, meeting his eyes in the mirror. Cassian's hands stilled in the act of removing his shirt. For a moment, his carefully maintained composure cracked, and she saw raw hunger flash across his features. "I think you know exactly what you are, Mariah." The use of her first name, spoken in that low, rough voice, sent shivers down her spine. In the 2 weeks since their marriage, he had maintained careful formality, calling her Mrs. Holt or nothing at all. Hearing her name on his lips felt intimate in ways that their shared bed somehow hadn't. "Do I?" she asked, turning to face him directly. Cassian crossed the room in 2 strides, stopping just close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his bare chest. "You're 21 years old, strong enough to survive, crossing 3 states alone, smart enough to improve systems I've been using for years, and brave enough to call this place home despite knowing what I expect from you." His voice dropped to a whisper. "And yes, you're beautiful enough to make men forget their manners and their honor." The admission hung between them like a challenge. Mariah felt her pulse quicken as she recognized the shift in their relationship. They were no longer playing the careful game of polite strangers bound by contract. Something deeper and more dangerous was awakening. "Is that what worries you?" she asked. "That I might forget my obligations?" Cassian's laugh was short and harsh. "What worries me is that I'm starting to care more about keeping you than I do about the sons you're supposed to give me." The confession seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. For a moment, vulnerability flickered across his features before his walls slammed back into place. But it was too late. She had seen it, and the knowledge that she was affecting him as strongly as he affected her changed everything. "The 3 months aren't up yet," she said softly. "No, they're not." His eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "But I'm finding it harder every day to remember why I agreed to wait." The space between them seemed to crackle with unspoken possibilities. Mariah felt the pull of attraction that had been building since their first meeting, the awareness that had sharpened with each small kindness and shared glance. It would be so easy to close the distance between them, to let passion override the careful boundaries they had established. But she also knew that once that line was crossed, there would be no going back to the relative safety of their current arrangement. If she gave herself to him now, it would be because she wanted to, not because their contract demanded it, and that would make her vulnerable in ways she wasn't sure she was ready to risk. "I should finish getting ready for bed," she said finally, breaking the charged moment. Cassian nodded slowly, but his eyes never left her face. "Yes, you should." As they settled into bed, with the careful space that had become routine, Mariah was acutely aware of every breath, every small movement. The journal entry she would write tomorrow would struggle to capture the complexity of what was happening between them. The way marriage of convenience was slowly transforming into something neither of them had planned. Outside, the wind carried the sound of cattle lowing in the distance and the soft nicker of horses in the corrals. The sounds of the ranch settling into sleep, the rhythm of a life she was slowly making her own. But tonight, those familiar sounds were accompanied by the beating of her own heart and the knowledge that her careful plans for emotional distance were crumbling with each passing day. In 3 days, it would be exactly 3 weeks since she had stumbled onto the Holt Ranch seeking work. In that time, she had become a wife, a homemaker, and a partner in ways she hadn't expected. But more dangerously, she was beginning to fall in love with a man who had married her for her womb rather than her heart. The question that would keep her awake long into the night was whether Cassian Holt was capable of loving her in return, if she was setting herself up for a heartbreak that would make her previous losses seem trivial by comparison. The silver locket had belonged to Cassian's mother, and Mariah discovered it quite by accident while organizing his desk drawers. The delicate piece seemed impossibly fragile in comparison to everything else in his study. The heavy furniture, the mounted weapons, the ledgers filled with bold, masculine handwriting. Inside the locket was a miniature portrait of a woman with gentle eyes and Cassian's strong jaw, painted in the careful detail that spoke of love and money spent on preserving memory. "You shouldn't be going through my personal things." Mariah turned to find Cassian standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. She had been so absorbed in the portrait that she hadn't heard his approach. "I'm sorry," she said, moving to close the locket. "I was organizing your desk, and it was mixed in with the business papers." "Leave it." His voice was rougher than usual as he crossed to where she stood. "You might as well know about her." Cassian took the locket from her hands with surprising gentleness, his thumb tracing the worn silver surface. "Elizabeth Holt. She died when I was 12. Fever took her quick. My father never recovered from losing her." The pain in his voice was carefully controlled, but unmistakable. Mariah felt something shift in her understanding of the man she had married. "She was beautiful," she said softly. "She was everything my father wasn't. Gentle, kind, believed in the goodness of people." Cassian's smile was bitter. "The ranch damn near went under after she died because he couldn't focus on anything but his grief. That's when I learned that depending on someone, loving them, makes you weak." The confession explained so much about his approach to their marriage, the careful, emotional distance, the insistence on treating their union as a business arrangement. He was protecting himself from the kind of devastating loss that had nearly destroyed his father. "Love doesn't always make you weak," Mariah said carefully. "Sometimes it makes you stronger." Cassian's laugh was harsh. "Tell that to my father, who let this place fall apart while he drank himself into an early grave. Tell that to every man who's ever been betrayed by a woman he trusted." The bitterness in his voice spoke of personal experience as well as inherited pain. Mariah thought of the scar on his face, the story Mrs. Henderson had whispered about his first wife's betrayal. Cassian had learned early that love was dangerous, and he had built his life around avoiding that particular weakness. "Not all women are like your first wife," she said quietly. "No?" His eyes held hers with challenging intensity. "Then tell me, Mariah, if a better offer came along tomorrow, if some wealthy rancher or railroad man decided he wanted a young, beautiful wife, would you stay here out of loyalty to me? Or would you take the opportunity to improve your circumstances?" The question hit her like a physical blow. That he could ask it, could believe she was capable of such betrayal, hurt more than she wanted to admit. But she also recognized the fear beneath his harsh words, the terror of a man who had been abandoned before and couldn't bear the thought of it happening again. "I would stay," she said simply. "This is my home now. Even though I can't promise you love, even though our arrangement is based on necessity rather than affection." Mariah moved closer, close enough to see the vulnerability he tried so hard to hide. "Even then, because I think you're wrong about love making people weak. I think it makes them fight harder for what matters." Cassian stared at her for a long moment, as if trying to read the truth in her face. Then, with deliberate care, he fastened the locket around her neck. The silver was warm from his touch, and the weight of it against her throat felt like both gift and promise. "My mother would have liked you," he said gruffly. "She always said a man needed a woman with steel in her spine to stand beside him in this country." Before Mariah could respond, the sound of galloping horses drew their attention to the window. A group of riders approached the house at dangerous speed, and even from a distance she could see the tension in their postures. "Trouble," Cassian muttered, already moving toward the gun rack mounted on his study wall. Jake Morrison burst through the front door without ceremony, his face grim with urgent news. "Boss, we got problems." Steele's men cut the fence on the south pasture and drove off near 50 head of cattle. Tommy saw them heading toward the territorial line. Mariah felt ice form in her stomach. 50 head of cattle represented significant wealth, but more than that, it was a direct challenge to Cassian's authority. In frontier justice, a man who couldn't protect his property wouldn't keep it long. "How many men?" Cassian asked, checking the loads in his rifle with practiced efficiency. 6, maybe 8. They're riding hard, but Tommy says they're pushing the cattle slow. Probably figure to sell them quick at the railhead before anyone can prove ownership. Cassian's jaw tightened with barely controlled rage. "Get the men ready. We leave in 10 minutes. As Jake hurried out to gather the ranch hands, Mariah found herself facing the reality of frontier life in its rawest form. The men she had come to know and care about were riding into danger, possibly into a fight that could leave some of them dead. And Cassian, the man she was beginning to love despite all her careful intentions, would be leading them. "How dangerous is this?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Dangerous enough." Cassian strapped on his gun belt, the familiar weight settling against his hip like an old friend. "Steele's men aren't likely to give up the cattle without a fight, and they've got the advantage of a head start." "Then don't go." The words slipped out before she could stop them, born from fear and the sudden, overwhelming realization of how much she stood to lose. Cassian's hands stilled on his holster. "What did you say?" Heat flooded Mariah's cheeks, but she lifted her chin defiantly. "I said don't go. Send Jake and the others if you must. But you don't have to be the one to." "To what?" "To defend my own property, to show that I won't be robbed and humiliated by Marcus Steele." Cassian's voice was dangerously quiet. "Is that what you think of me, Mariah? That I'm the kind of man who sends others to fight his battles? I think you're the kind of man this ranch can't afford to lose." She shot back, abandoning all pretense of wifely submission. "What good does it do to recover 50 head of cattle if you get yourself killed in the process?" The raw fear in her voice seemed to surprise him. For a moment, his expression softened, and she saw something that might have been tenderness in his winter-pale eyes. "You're worried about me," he said, and it was not quite a question. "Of course I'm worried about you." The admission cost her, leaving her vulnerable in ways she hadn't intended. "You're my husband." "Am I?" The question was softly asked, but weighted with meaning. "Or am I just the man who offered you shelter when you needed it?" The space between them suddenly felt charged with unspoken truths and carefully hidden feelings. Mariah realized they had reached a crossroads in their relationship, a moment when the careful facades they had maintained could no longer hide the depth of what was growing between them. "You're the man I chose," she said quietly. "The man I worry about when he rides into danger. The man whose children I want to bear not because of our agreement, but because I love him." The words hung in the air like smoke from a branding iron, marking this moment as irrevocably as any physical brand. Cassian's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, disbelief, and something that might have been hope. Mariah. Boss. Jake's voice from the yard cut through whatever Cassian might have said. Men are ready. Cassian's jaw tightened with frustration at the interruption. He moved toward the door, then stopped, turning back to face her with an expression she couldn't read. We'll finish this conversation when I get back, he said. You'd better come back, Mariah replied, putting all her newfound courage into the words. Because I meant what I said, and I won't be cheated out of the chance to say it again. Something that might have been a smile touched the corners of Cassian's mouth. Yes, ma'am. Then he was gone, leaving Mariah alone with the echo of her own confession and the silver locket warm against her throat. Through the window, she watched him mount his black stallion and lead his men toward the southern pastures, a column of determined riders disappearing into the distance. As the dust settled and quiet returned to the ranch yard, Mariah realized that everything had changed in the space of a few moments. She had admitted her love, revealed the depth of her commitment to their marriage, and in doing so, had made herself vulnerable to the kind of heartbreak she had sworn to avoid. But as she touched the locket at her throat and thought of the gentle woman in the portrait, she also realized that some risks were worth taking. Love might make people vulnerable, but it also gave them something worth fighting for. And if Cassian Holt was worth fighting for, and she was beginning to believe he was, then she would stand beside him in whatever battles lay ahead, whether he loved her in return or not. The afternoon stretched ahead with agonizing slowness, filled with the terrible waiting that was the lot of women in a violent world. But Mariah had survived worse than waiting, and she would survive this too. She had work to do, a household to manage, and a place to defend in whatever way she could. When Cassian returned, and she refused to consider any other possibility, they would indeed finish their conversation. And perhaps, if she was very lucky, he would find the courage to admit that love might not be the weakness he had always believed it to be. The ceremonial tomahawk hung above the fireplace in Cassian's study, its blade gleaming with the patina of age and careful maintenance. Mariah had noticed it before, but had never asked about its significance. Now, as she waited for news of the cattle recovery expedition, she found herself staring at the weapon and thinking about the complex relationships that defined frontier life. Mrs. Henderson found her there as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. That belonged to White Bear, chief of the local Arapaho band, the older woman explained, settling into a chair with her mending. He gave it to Mr. Holt's father 20 years ago, after they made peace over the grazing rights. It's been in this house ever since, a reminder that some conflicts can be settled with honor instead of blood. But not all of them, Mariah observed, thinking of the men who had ridden out that morning. No, child, not all of them. Mrs. Henderson's voice carried the weight of experience. Some men, like Marcus Steele, only understand force. They mistake kindness for weakness and honor for stupidity. The afternoon had brought disturbing news from unexpected sources. 3 neighboring ranchers had stopped by the house, ostensibly to pay social calls, but actually to share information that painted a troubling picture of Marcus Steele's activities. He's been pressuring the smaller spreads to sell, Thomas Brennan had explained, his weathered face grave with concern. Making offers that sound generous until you realize he's buying at prices that won't let folks start over anywhere else. And those who refuse his offers find themselves facing all manner of problems, added Samuel Hayes from the ranch to the north. Fences cut, waterholes fouled, cattle scattered. Nothing that can be proven in a court of law, but enough to make life unbearable. The pattern was clear and chilling. Marcus Steele was systematically working to control the entire valley, using a combination of legal pressure and barely concealed intimidation. The theft of Cassian's cattle was just the latest escalation in a campaign that had been building for months. He's testing us, Mariah had realized aloud, seeing how far he can push before we push back. And if we don't push back hard enough, Samuel had asked, then he'll know we're vulnerable and he'll keep pushing until we break. The men had exchanged glances at her assessment, surprised by the strategic thinking from Cassian's young wife. But Mariah had grown up listening to her father discuss the challenges of farming, the delicate balance between cooperation and competition that defined rural life. She understood that some conflicts were about more than immediate gains. They were about establishing dominance for future battles. Now, as evening approached with no word from the pursuing party, Mariah found herself planning for possibilities she prayed wouldn't come to pass. If Cassian didn't return, if the worst happened, she would need to be ready to hold the ranch together until help could arrive. It was a responsibility that terrified and strengthened her in equal measure. "You love him." Mrs. Henderson's quiet observation broke through Mariah's anxious thoughts. The older woman was watching her with knowing eyes, her mending forgotten in her lap. "Is it that obvious?" Mariah asked. "Only to someone who's seen love before. The way you watch for him, the way you light up when he enters a room, the way you've been pacing like a caged wildcat since he rode out this morning." Mrs. Henderson smiled gently. "The question is, does he love you back?" It was the question that had been haunting Mariah since her confession that morning. Cassian had been surprised by her admission, perhaps even pleased, but he hadn't returned the sentiment. She was beginning to understand that for a man with his history, trust was a more precious gift than passion, and love was the most dangerous vulnerability of all. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I think he's beginning to care more than he intended." "Oh, child, he's been gone since the day he brought you home. A blind woman could see how he looks at you when he thinks no one's watching." Mrs. Henderson picked up her mending again, her needle flashing in the lamplight. "The man's just too stubborn and scared to admit it, even to himself." The sound of hoofbeats in the yard sent both women to the window. In the gathering dusk, Mariah could make out the silhouettes of returning riders. She counted them quickly: 1, 2, 3, her heart sinking as she realized there should be more. "Where are the others?" she whispered. But then more riders emerged from the shadows, driving a group of cattle before them. Relief flooded through her as she recognized Cassian's tall figure on his black stallion, alive and apparently unharmed. The mission had been successful, but the cost was yet to be determined. When Cassian entered the house 20 minutes later, Mariah was waiting for him in the hallway. His clothes were dusty and torn, there was blood on his knuckles, and exhaustion lined his face. But his eyes sought hers immediately, and the relief she saw there mirrored her own. "The cattle?" she asked. "Recovered. All 50 head." His voice was rough with fatigue. "Steele's men didn't put up much of a fight once they realized we meant business. And our men? Tommy took a bullet in the shoulder, but it's clean. Doc Patterson's already seen to him." Cassian moved closer, close enough that she could smell the dust and sweat of the long day. "We need to talk." Before she could respond, he was leading her into his study and closing the door behind them. The privacy felt charged with unfinished business and the weight of her morning confession. "You said you loved me," he began without preamble. "I did." Mariah lifted her chin, refusing to apologize for the truth. "And I meant it." Cassian moved to the window, staring out at the darkening landscape. "Love is a luxury I can't afford, Mariah. Not in this life, not with what I'm trying to build. Can't afford it or afraid of it?" The question made him turn, and she saw the flash of anger in his eyes. "Careful, wife. You're treading on dangerous ground." "Good." The word surprised them both with its quiet fierceness. "Maybe it's time someone did. Maybe it's time someone told you that hiding behind your father's pain and your first wife's betrayal isn't strength, it's cowardice." The silence that followed was thick with tension and the possibility of violence. Cassian's hands clenched at his sides, and for a moment Mariah wondered if she had pushed too far. But she had committed herself to honesty, and she wouldn't retreat now. "You want to know what I learned today?" she continued, her voice steady, despite the danger she was courting. "I learned that this ranch, this life we're building, means nothing if we're too afraid to fight for it. And I'm not talking about fighting Marcus Steele, I'm talking about fighting for each other. I brought you here to bear my children, not to reform my character. Maybe, but you married a woman with a mind of her own, and I won't apologize for using it." Mariah moved closer, drawn by the pain she could see beneath his anger. "You want sons, Cassian. Then give them a father who knows how to love as well as how to fight. Give them a legacy worth inheriting." Something shifted in Cassian's expression, a crack in the armor he had worn for so long. "You think it's that simple?" "I think it's that hard, but some things are worth being hard for." They stood facing each other in the lamplight, two strong-willed people caught between desire and fear, between the safety of emotional distance and the terrifying vulnerability of connection. The silver locket at Mariah's throat caught the light, a reminder of the love that had once thrived in this house before tragedy and betrayal had poisoned it. "I can't promise you love," Cassian said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then promise me honesty, promise me partnership, promise me that you'll try to see me as more than just a means to an end." The request hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they dared to cross. But as Cassian looked at the woman who had transformed his house into a home, who had stood beside him in crisis and challenged him to be better than his fears, he felt something long frozen begin to thaw in his chest. "I can promise you that," he said. It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was a beginning. And as Mariah moved into his arms for the first time since their wedding night, she realized that sometimes the most important victories were measured not in ground taken, but in walls torn down. Outside, the wind carried the sound of cattle settling for the night and the soft voices of men who had risked their lives for their employer's honor. The ranch was secure for now, but greater challenges lay ahead. Marcus Steele would not give up his ambitions easily, and the battles to come would test more than their ability to defend cattle and land. But tonight, in the circle of Cassian's arms, Mariah felt hope take root in her heart. They had a foundation, now honesty, respect, and the possibility of something deeper. It might not be love yet, but it was the soil in which love could grow, given time and tending. The tomahawk above the fireplace gleamed in the lamplight, a reminder that some conflicts could indeed be settled with honor. And perhaps, if they were very lucky, the conflict between fear and love could be settled the same way. The forged deed arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a nervous clerk from the territorial courthouse who clearly wished he was anywhere else. Mariah signed for the official-looking document while Cassian was out checking the north pastures, and the moment she broke the wax seal, she knew they were in serious trouble. The paper was thick and expensive, bearing what appeared to be territorial seals and legal language that made her head spin. But the core message was clear enough. Marcus Steele was claiming that the original land grant for the Holt Ranch had been improperly filed, and that his family held prior claim to the entire northern section of their property, including the main house, barns, and most valuable grazing land. Mariah's hands trembled as she read the document a second time, her mind racing through the implications. If Steele could make this claim stick in territorial court, they would lose everything Cassian had spent 15 years building. The ranch would be reduced to marginal land that couldn't support a tenth of their current operations. But something about the document bothered her beyond its devastating contents. The language was too formal, too perfectly legal for something that should have been filed decades ago. The paper looked old, but the ink seemed too fresh, too crisp for something that had been sitting in courthouse files for 20 years. When Cassian returned an hour later, Mariah met him at the door with the deed in her hands and fear written across her face. "What is it?" he asked, immediately alert to her distress. This came from the courthouse. She handed him the document, watching his face darken as he read. "Cassian, if this is legitimate." "It's not." His voice was flat with certainty. "My father filed those land claims personally. I was with him when he rode to Cheyenne to make sure everything was properly recorded." "But how can you prove that? If Steele has documentation that predates your father's claim?" "Because Steele's family never owned land in this valley." Cassian moved to his desk, pulling out a thick folder of documents. "My father kept copies of everything, every transaction, every filing, every piece of correspondence with the territorial government, and he kept a journal of every significant event related to this ranch." As Cassian spread papers across his desk, Mariah moved closer to examine them. Her education, hidden for so long, finally became relevant as she began to decipher the legal language and compare dates and signatures. "This is interesting," she murmured, pointing to a discrepancy in one of Steele's documents. The territorial seal on his deed shows a date of 1847, but the territorial government didn't start using this particular seal design until 1851. "I've seen enough official documents helping my father with farm business to recognize the difference." Cassian looked up sharply. "You can read legal documents?" Heat rose in Mariah's cheeks as she realized her slip. Throughout their marriage, she had been careful to hide the extent of her education, playing the role of a simple farm girl who could manage basic household accounts, but nothing more sophisticated. The deception had become so natural that she had almost forgotten it was a lie. "Eyes. My father believed girls should be educated same as boys. He taught me to read and write, basic mathematics, even some law and business." She met Cassian's eyes defiantly. "I've been able to read and understand every document on this ranch since the day I arrived." The silence that followed was thunderous. Cassian stared at her as if seeing a stranger, his expression cycling through surprise, admiration, and something that might have been betrayal. "You've been pretending to be less intelligent than you are," he said slowly. "I've been surviving," Mariah replied. "Men don't like women who are too educated. It makes them uncomfortable, threatens their sense of superiority. I learned early that it was safer to let people underestimate me." "Including your husband?" The hurt in his voice made her chest tight. "Especially my husband. You married me to bear your sons, not to challenge your authority or show up your education." Cassian was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if memorizing it. "What else have you been hiding from me?" "Nothing that matters to our arrangement," she said carefully. "Our arrangement." He repeated the words with bitter emphasis. "Is that still what this is to you? An arrangement?" The question hung between them, weighted with the memory of her confession of love and his promise of honesty. Mariah realized that her deception, however well-intentioned, had damaged the fragile trust they had been building. "No," she said quietly. "It stopped being just an arrangement weeks ago, but old habits die hard, and I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Afraid you'd see my intelligence as a threat instead of an asset. Afraid you'd think I was trying to manipulate you or make you look foolish." She gestured to the papers spread across his desk. "Afraid of exactly what's happening right now." Cassian's jaw tightened, but when he spoke, his voice was more thoughtful than angry. "You're right about one thing. I probably would have seen it as a threat at first. But you're wrong about now." He moved closer, his eyes intense. "Right now, I need every advantage I can get. And if my wife has a mind sharp enough to spot forgeries and legal inconsistencies, then God help me, I'll take it." The admission seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. For a man who had built his life around control and dominance, accepting help from his wife, especially help that required acknowledging her superior knowledge, in some areas represented a significant shift. "So what do we do?" Mariah asked, focusing on the immediate crisis. "We prove that Steele's documents are forgeries, and we do it before the territorial judge arrives next week for the scheduled hearing." Mariah bent over the papers again, her mind working through possibilities. "We need to compare the signatures on his documents with known examples of the officials who supposedly signed them. And we need to verify the chain of custody for the original land grants." "The courthouse in Cheyenne would have records going back that far," Cassian said. "But it's a 3-day ride, and we'd need someone who could navigate the territorial bureaucracy." "Or," Mariah said slowly, an idea forming, "we need someone who can examine these documents more closely and provide expert testimony about their authenticity. The territorial judge isn't likely to take the word of a local expert over official-looking documentation." "No, but he might listen to someone with credentials from back east. Someone like Professor Morrison from the university in Denver. He's done work authenticating historical documents, and his reputation would carry weight even in territorial court." Cassian stared at her. "How do you know about Professor Morrison?" I read, Cassian. I read everything I can, get my hands on newspapers, legal journals, anything that might be useful someday. Mariah straightened her shoulders. I may have been hiding my education, but I never stopped using it. For the first time since she had handed him Steele's forged deed, Cassian smiled. It was a predatory smile, the expression of a man who had just realized he had been underestimating his most valuable ally. Can you get Morrison here? I can try, but it will take time, and Steele won't wait patiently while we build our case. As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching riders drew their attention to the window. A large party of men was approaching the house, led by Marcus Steele himself. Even from a distance, his posture radiated arrogant confidence. He's coming to gloat, Cassian said, his voice hard as winter stone. Or to make demands, Mariah replied, quickly gathering the papers from the desk. Either way, he doesn't need to know what we've discovered about his documentation. Cassian nodded, moving to the gun rack with practiced efficiency. Stay in the house. This could get ugly. I'm not hiding, Mariah said firmly. I'm Mrs. Cassian Holt, and this is my home too. If Steele wants to make threats, he can make them to both of us. The look Cassian gave her was complex, part exasperation, part admiration, and part something that might have been love. You're going to be the death of me, woman. Not if I can help it, she replied, checking to make sure his mother's locket was safely tucked beneath her dress. We're going to fight this, Cassian, together, and we're going to win. As they prepared to face Marcus Steele and whatever ultimatum he had brought, Mariah felt a strange sense of completion. The careful masks they had both worn were finally falling away, revealing the true partnership that had been building beneath their surface arrangements. She was no longer just the desperate girl who had accepted marriage as a means of survival, and he was no longer just the rancher who had seen her as a vessel for his ambitions. They were husband and wife in the truest sense, united not just by law and convenience, but by shared purpose and growing trust. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as equals, with all their combined strengths and intelligence. The sound of boots on the front porch announced Steele's arrival. The real battle for the Holt Ranch was about to begin. The Winchester rifle had been Cassian's father's favorite weapon, a lever-action model that had helped carve civilization from wilderness and protect what was built from those who would take it. Now it leaned against the mantel in his study, loaded and ready, while Cassian and Mariah worked through the night, preparing their defense against Marcus Steele's legal assault. 3 days had passed since Steele's visit, 3 days filled with desperate activity as they gathered evidence and built their case. The confrontation had been tense, but civilized Steele had presented his demands with the confidence of a man holding winning cards, while Cassian had listened with the stone-faced control of a poker player concealing his hand. I'm being generous, Holt, Steele had said, his voice carrying the weight of false magnanimity. I could take everything through the courts, but I'm willing to let you keep the southern pastures, enough land for a small operation, maybe 500 head of cattle. You could make a decent living. How considerate, Cassian had replied, his tone dangerously quiet. And in return for this generosity, you vacate the main house and turn over the deed to the disputed land. No fuss, no expensive legal battles. Clean and simple. It had been Mariah who spoke next, her voice carrying the authority of the lady of the house. Mr. Steele, surely you understand that such a significant decision requires careful consideration of all the legal documentation involved. We'll need time to review your claims thoroughly. Steele's eyes had narrowed as he studied her, perhaps sensing something more dangerous than he had expected from Cassian's young wife. The territorial judge arrives next week, Mrs. Holt. I'd advise you not to waste time on futile resistance. Now, with the judge due to arrive in 3 days, their preparation had taken on desperate urgency. Professor Morrison had agreed to examine their documents, but his train wouldn't arrive until the morning of the hearing. Everything depended on their ability to present a cohesive defense based on evidence they were still gathering. The signature analysis is promising, Mariah said, bent over a collection of documents spread across the dining room table. She had transformed the formal room into a legal war room, with papers organized in precise stacks and a magnifying glass borrowed from Cassian's desk, serving as her primary tool. The Robert Sullivan signature on Steele's deed doesn't match any of the verified examples we have from the territorial archives. Cassian looked up from his own worker-detailed timeline of land transactions in the valley dating back to the original territorial surveys. Sullivan was the territorial recorder from 1845 to 1850. If Steele's documents were genuine, Sullivan would have signed them. But look at this. Mariah handed him the magnifying glass, pointing to a subtle detail in the forged signature. Whoever created this signature copied it from a document dated 1849, but they made a crucial mistake. In 1847, Sullivan injured his right hand in a hunting accident. Signatures from that period have a distinctive tremor that's missing from this forgery. The precision of her analysis filled Cassian with a mixture of admiration and regret. How many other insights had she kept hidden during their weeks of marriage? How much more effective could their partnership have been if she had felt safe revealing her intelligence from the beginning? "You should have told me," he said quietly. Mariah's hands stilled on the papers. "Would you have believed me, or would you have seen it as presumption from a desperate woman trying to make herself indispensable?" The honest answer was complicated. The man who had married her 6 weeks ago would probably have been threatened by her education, would have seen it as a challenge to his authority. But the man who had watched her transform his house into a home, who had seen her stand beside him in crisis, who had fallen in love with her courage and strength, that man recognized her intelligence as a gift rather than a threat. "I would have been a fool not to," he said finally. A knock at the front door interrupted their work. Jake Morrison entered with news that made Cassian's blood run cold. "Boss, we got visitors in town." Tommy saw them checking into the hotel, 6 men, all wearing guns and looking like they know how to use them. Word is they're working for Steele. The implications were clear. Marcus Steele wasn't content to rely solely on legal maneuvering. He was preparing for the possibility that his forged documents might not hold up in court, and he wanted muscle available to enforce his will through other means. "Professional gunmen?" Cassian asked. "Look like it. The kind that hire out to cattle barons and railroad companies when they need problems solved permanently." Mariah felt ice form in her stomach. The civilized veneer of legal proceedings was about to give way to the brutal realities of frontier justice. "He's planning to intimidate the judge, or eliminate the opposition if the legal route fails," Cassian said grimly. "Either way, we need to be ready for more than courtroom arguments." The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation that went far beyond legal strategy. Cassian quietly positioned his most trusted men around the ranch, armed and ready for trouble. Mariah continued her documentary analysis while also preparing for the possibility that they might need to defend their home with more than words. The evening before the hearing, as they sat in the study reviewing their final arguments, Mariah found herself studying Cassian's profile in the lamplight. The harsh lines of his face had softened somewhat during their weeks together, but tonight the old hardness was back, the expression of a man preparing for war. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I'm thinking that I should have killed Marcus Steele years ago, when he first started causing trouble." His voice was matter-of-fact, as if discussing weather or cattle prices. "And I'm thinking that if we lose tomorrow, we lose everything we've built together." Cassian turned to face her fully. "Not everything. Whatever happens to the ranch, you'll be safe. I've made arrangements." "Stop." Mariah's voice cut through his words like a blade. "Don't you dare start making plans that don't include me. We're in this together, Cassian Holt, and we'll face whatever comes together. This isn't your fight, Mariah. You married me for security, not to die defending land that might not even be ours." The words hit her like a physical blow. After everything they had shared, all the walls they had torn down, he still saw her as someone who would abandon him when the going got rough. "You're wrong," she said, rising from her chair with the fluid grace of suppressed anger. "I married you for security, yes. But I chose to love you, and I chose to make this place my home. Those aren't decisions I take lightly, and they aren't ones I abandon at the first sign of trouble." Cassian stood as well, his height forcing her to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. "Love is a luxury we can't afford right now. Love is the only thing that makes any of this worth fighting for." Mariah moved closer, close enough to place her hand over his heart. "You want to know what I'm fighting for tomorrow? Not just the land or the cattle or even the house. I'm fighting for the life we're building together, for the children we'll have, for the legacy we'll leave behind. And if we lose, then we'll start over, together. But we're not going to lose, because we have something Marcus Steele doesn't have." "What's that?" "We have the truth, and we have each other." The simple declaration seemed to strip away the last of Cassian's defenses. For a moment, the mask of control slipped completely, and she saw the fear he had been hiding, not fear of losing the ranch, but fear of losing her. "I love you," he said, the words seeming to surprise him as much as they did her. "God help me, I love you more than this land, more than my plans for sons and dynasty, more than anything I've ever loved in my life." The confession hung in the air between them like a bridge finally completed. Mariah felt tears prick her eyes as the last barrier between them crumbled. "Then trust me to stand beside you tomorrow," she said. "Trust me to be worthy of that love." Cassian's answer was to pull her into his arms, holding her against his chest, as if he could absorb her into his very bones. "I'm scared," he admitted against her hair. "I'm scared of losing everything again." "So am I," she whispered back. "But some things are worth being scared for." They held each other in the lamplight, two people who had found love in the most unlikely circumstances and were now preparing to defend it against overwhelming odds. Outside, the wind rattled the windows and carried the sound of night birds calling across the prairie. The familiar sounds of their domain, the life they had built together from nothing but determination and growing affection. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Cassian said, "I want you to know that these weeks with you have been the happiest of my life." "They're not ending tomorrow," Mariah replied with fierce certainty. "We're going to win, and then we're going to spend the next 50 years being disgustingly happy together." Despite the gravity of their situation, Cassian smiled. 50 years? At least, I plan to be a very demanding wife. You already are." They talked through the night, reviewing their strategy and sharing the kind of intimate conversation that married couples rarely had time for in the busy routine of daily life. As dawn approached, painting the sky with shades of rose and gold, they felt as ready as they could be for the battle ahead. Professor Morrison's train arrived on schedule, and the scholarly man proved to be everything Mariah had hoped: knowledgeable, thorough, and possessing the kind of academic credentials that even territorial judges respected. His preliminary examination of Steele's documents confirmed their suspicions about forgery, and his willingness to testify provided them with their strongest weapon. "The paper stock is wrong for 1,847, he explained to Cassian and Mariah as they rode toward town. "The watermark pattern wasn't used by territorial government until 1,850, and the ink composition is consistent with formulations developed after 1,855. Whoever created these documents was skilled, but they made several critical errors that betray their modern origin." The courthouse in Coyote Gulch was packed when they arrived. Word of the dispute had spread throughout the valley, and every rancher and townsperson understood that the outcome would set precedents for future land disputes. Marcus Steele sat at the plaintiff's table with two lawyers imported from Denver, his posture radiating confidence. His hired gunmen were conspicuously present in the gallery, their presence a not-so-subtle reminder of the consequences of disappointing their employer. Judge Harrison was an elderly man with piercing eyes and a reputation for fairness tempered by pragmatism. He had seen enough frontier justice to understand when legal proceedings were backed by the threat of violence, and his expression, as he surveyed the packed courtroom, suggested he was not pleased by the atmosphere. "This hearing will be conducted according to law," he announced before calling the session to order. "Anyone who disrupts these proceedings will be removed and charged accordingly." As Steele's lawyers began their presentation, Outlining their clients' claims with practiced eloquence, Mariah felt the weight of her hidden education pressing against her chest like her mother's wedding ring. Soon, she would have to reveal the full extent of her knowledge, would have to stand before this room full of men and demonstrate expertise they never would have expected from a rancher's young wife. But as Cassian's hand found hers under the table, she also felt strength flow between them. They were partners now in the truest sense, united not just by law and convenience, but by love and shared purpose. Whatever the outcome of this hearing, they would face it together. The battle for the Holt Ranch was about to reach its climax, and Mariah June Holt was ready to fight for everything she had come to love. The territory map spread across the prosecution's table told the story. Marcus Steele wanted the court to believe boundaries marked in red ink that would strip away 2/3 of the Holt Ranch and consolidate it under his control. Judge Harrison studied the document with the careful attention it deserved, his weathered fingers tracing the proposed property lines, while Steele's lead attorney, a sharp-faced man named Blackwood, outlined their case with practiced eloquence. "Your Honor, the evidence is clear and overwhelming," Blackwood declared, his voice carrying the authority of expensive legal education. "My client's family has held legitimate claim to these lands since 1847, predating Mr. Holt's occupation by nearly 3 years. The territorial records, properly filed and witnessed, support this claim beyond any reasonable doubt." From her seat beside Cassian, Mariah watched the proceedings with the careful attention of someone whose entire future hung in the balance. Steele's presentation was masterful. The forged documents looked authentic, the legal arguments were sound, and the supporting evidence had been crafted by someone who understood how territorial law worked. But she also noticed the small details that betrayed the fraud. The way Blackwood avoided direct questions about the chain of custody for certain documents. The slight hesitation when Judge Harrison asked about witness testimony from the original filing. The careful phrasing that skirted around specifics that could be verified through independent sources. "Mr. Blackwood," Judge Harrison interrupted, "you claim these documents were filed in 1847, but I see no record of the required survey markers being placed or verified by territorial authorities. How do you account for this oversight?" For the first time, Steele's lawyer looked uncomfortable. "Your Honor, the survey requirements in 1847 were less stringent than current standards. Many early land grants were processed without full survey documentation, but not without witness testimony and local verification." The judge replied dryly, "The territorial government may have been less bureaucratic in 1847, but they weren't careless about property rights." Mariah felt a flutter of hope at the judge's skepticism, but she knew their real test would come when it was their turn to present evidence. Professor Morrison sat beside their local attorney, a young man named Peters, who had been practicing law for only 2 years, but whose honesty and preparation had impressed both Cassian and Mariah. When their turn came, Peters stood with visible nervousness, but spoke with growing confidence as he outlined their defense. "Your Honor, we believe the plaintiff's documents are sophisticated forgeries created to support a fraudulent land claim. We have expert testimony and documentary evidence that will prove this conclusively." "A serious allegation, Mr. Peters. I trust you have substantial proof to support such claims." "We do, Your Honor." I called Professor Richard Morrison to the stand. The academic took the witness stand with the calm dignity of someone accustomed to presenting complex information to skeptical audiences. His credentials were impeccable: 20 years of experience in document authentication, recognition as an expert by courts in 3 states, and a reputation for scrupulous honesty that had survived challenges from railroad lawyers and cattle barons alike. "Professor Morrison," Peters began, "have you had the opportunity to examine the documents presented by the plaintiff?" "I have. I spent considerable time analyzing both the paper composition and the ink characteristics, as well as comparing signatures with verified examples from the territorial archives." "And what did your analysis reveal?" Morrison's testimony was methodical and devastating. He explained the anachronistic watermarks, the inconsistent aging patterns, and the chemical composition of inks that hadn't been available in 1847. But it was his analysis of the signatures that delivered the killing blow to Steele's case. The signature attributed to Robert Sullivan, the territorial recorder, contains several characteristics that prove it's a modern forgery. Morrison explained, using a magnifying glass to point out details on a projected document. Mr. Sullivan injured his right hand in a hunting accident in October of 1846. All authentic signatures from 1847 show evidence of this injury in the form of a distinctive tremor. The signature on the plaintiff's document shows no such tremor, indicating it was copied from an earlier example. A murmur ran through the packed courtroom. Even Judge Harrison looked impressed by the thoroughness of the analysis. Furthermore, Morrison continued, the paper stock used for these documents contains wood pulp processing techniques that weren't developed until the 1850s. The territorial government used rag paper exclusively until 1851, and the fiber composition of the plaintiff's documents is entirely inconsistent with period standards. Blackwood's cross-examination was aggressive but ineffective. Morrison's expertise was unassailable, and his testimony was backed by scientific evidence that couldn't be dismissed as mere opinion. But it was Mariah's testimony that truly turned the tide of the hearing. When Peters called her to the stand, a ripple of surprise ran through the courtroom. It was unusual for a woman to testify in land disputes, and many of the spectators clearly wondered what Cassian's young wife could possibly contribute to such complex legal proceedings. Mrs. Holt, Peters began, you've been involved in analyzing the documentary evidence in this case. Can you tell the court about your qualifications for such work? This was the moment Mariah had been preparing, for the moment when she would finally reveal the education she had hidden for so long. I was educated by my father, who believed that women should be as knowledgeable about business and legal matters as men. I can read and write in English and French. I have studied mathematics through advanced algebra, and I have practical experience in contract analysis and document authentication. The admission sent a buzz through the courtroom. Several men exchanged skeptical glances, clearly doubtful that a frontier woman could possess such education. And what did your analysis of the plaintiff's documents reveal? Mariah's voice grew stronger as she warmed to her subject. The legal language used in the documents contains terminology that wasn't standardized in territorial law until 1849. Specifically, the phrase hereditaments and appurtenances in connection with water rights wasn't used in territorial grants until the Water Rights Act of 1849. Judge Harrison leaned forward with interest. You're certain of this chronology? Yes, Your Honor. I've studied the evolution of territorial law as part of my research into our own property rights. The language in Mr. Steele's documents is anachronistic, uses legal terms that didn't exist when the documents were supposedly created. Objection, Blackwood interrupted. The witness is not a qualified legal expert. Your Honor, Peters replied smoothly. Mrs. Holt is testifying about her research into publicly available legal documents. Her education and analysis are matters of fact, not legal opinion. Objection overruled. Continue, Mrs. Holt. Mariah presented her findings with the systematic precision of someone who had spent weeks preparing for this moment. She explained the inconsistencies in legal terminology, the suspicious uniformity of aging patterns across documents that should have been stored in different locations, and the mathematical impossibilities in the survey descriptions that would have placed property boundaries in locations that didn't exist. In conclusion, she said, meeting Judge Harrison's eyes directly, these documents are not just forgeries, they're poorly researched, forgeries that betray their modern origin in multiple ways. Mr. Steele is attempting to use fraudulent documentation to steal land that has been legally owned by the Holt family for 15 years. The courtroom erupted in whispers and exclamations. Steele's face had gone white with rage, and his hired gunmen were shifting restlessly in their seats. But Judge Harrison's attention was focused entirely on Mariah, and the approval in his eyes was unmistakable. "Thank you, Mrs. Holt. That was most illuminating." Blackwood's cross-examination was brutal, but Mariah held her ground with the courage that had carried her across 3 states and into a marriage that had become the foundation of her life. When he questioned her education, she provided specific examples. When he challenged her interpretations, she cited legal precedents. When he suggested she was lying to protect her husband's interests, she looked him in the eye and said simply, "I'm telling the truth, because the truth is what will protect our home." As she returned to her seat beside Cassian, Mariah felt his hand squeeze hers with pride and something deeper. She had revealed herself completely, her intelligence, her education, her capabilities, and instead of feeling threatened, he looked at her with the expression of a man who had just realized how lucky he was. Judge Harrison called for a brief recess before rendering his decision, and the courtroom buzzed with animated discussions about the testimony they had heard. But Mariah's attention was focused on Marcus Steele, who was conferring urgently with his lawyers and gunmen. The expression on his face was that of a man who had just watched his carefully laid plans crumble, and she knew that legal defeat might not be the end of their troubles. The real test was yet to come. The wedding ring set lay hidden in Cassian's vest pocket. 2 simple gold bands he had commissioned from the town blacksmith during the weeks when he had begun to understand that his marriage to Mariah was becoming something neither of them had planned. The original rings from their hasty ceremony had been borrowed from Mrs. Henderson, symbols of legal necessity rather than emotional commitment. These new rings represented choice, the decision to love each other freely rather than simply fulfill the terms of their arrangement. But as Judge Harrison returned to the bench to render his verdict, the rings remained hidden. The immediate crisis had to be resolved before they could think about the future they wanted to build together. After reviewing all the evidence presented, Judge Harrison began, his voice carrying the weight of territorial authority. "I find that the plaintiff has failed to establish legitimate claim to the disputed property. The documentary evidence presented by Mr. Steele contains multiple anachronisms and inconsistencies that clearly indicate modern forgery." A wave of relief swept through the Holt supporters in the courtroom. But Mariah noticed that Marcus Steele's expression hadn't changed. If anything, his face had hardened into the mask of a man who had expected this outcome and prepared accordingly. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "I am ordering the territorial attorney to investigate the origins of these forged documents. Fraudulent land claims are a serious offense against territorial law and will be prosecuted to the full extent of legal authority." The gavel came down with finality, officially ending Marcus Steele's legal challenge to the Holt Ranch. But even as Cassian stood to shake hands with their attorney and Professor Morrison, Mariah felt a chill of premonition. Men like Steele didn't accept defeat gracefully, especially when they had invested significant resources in their schemes. Her instincts proved correct. As the courtroom began to empty, Steele approached their table with his hired gunmen, flanking him like wolves, escorting their pack leader. "Congratulations, Holt," Steele said, his voice carrying the false cordiality of a man who had moved beyond civilized pretense. "You've won the legal battle, but we both know this isn't over." "The law has spoken," Cassian replied, his hand resting casually near his gun belt. "Your claim was fraudulent, and now everyone knows it." "The law?" Steele's laugh was cold and bitter. "The law is what men with power say it is, and I have more power than you think." Before Cassian could respond, one of Steele's gunmen stepped forward, a lean man with cold eyes and the kind of practiced stillness that marked a professional killer. "There's going to be an accident," the gunman said quietly, his words meant for Cassian but loud enough for Mariah to hear. "Maybe a fire, maybe rustlers, maybe your pretty wife gets lost riding alone and never makes it home." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a branding iron, marking this moment as the point where civilized discourse gave way to frontier violence. Cassian's hand moved to his gun, but before he could draw, Mariah stepped forward with the fluid grace of a woman who had learned to face danger without flinching. "Mr. Steele," she said, her voice carrying the authority of education and intelligence that had surprised everyone in the courtroom, "you might want to consider the wisdom of making threats in front of witnesses. Judge Harrison is still within earshot, and I'm sure he would be very interested to hear about your plans for accidents." Steele's eyes narrowed as he studied her, perhaps seeing her clearly for the first time. "You're not what I expected, Mrs. Holt." "No," she replied, moving closer to Cassian so they presented a united front. "I'm not, and neither is my husband. If you think we'll be intimidated by hired guns and veiled threats, you've seriously miscalculated." The standoff stretched for several heartbeats, the kind of tense moment that could explode into violence with the wrong word or gesture. But it was interrupted by the arrival of unexpected allies. Thomas Brennan entered the courthouse, flanked by a dozen other ranchers, all armed and all wearing expressions that left no doubt about their intentions. The message was clear: Cassian and Mariah weren't standing alone against Steele's threats. "Heard there might be trouble," Brennan said mildly, his hand resting on his gun butt. "Figured we'd offer our support to our neighbors." The arrival of armed allies changed the dynamics completely. Steele's gunmen were outnumbered and outmatched, facing not just Cassian but the combined firepower of half the valley's ranchers. Even professional killers had enough sense to recognize impossible odds. "This isn't over," Steele said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Yes, it is," Cassian replied with finality. "Take your hired guns and get off my land. If I see any of you near my property again, I'll assume you're there to steal cattle or threaten my wife, and I'll respond accordingly." The threat was quietly spoken but absolute, backed by the kind of certainty that came from a man defending everything he loved. Steele studied the faces arrayed against him, calculating odds and finding them wanting. "We'll see," he said finally, but he was already backing toward the door. As Steele and his men filed out of the courthouse, the tension in the room dissipated like smoke in wind. The ranchers who had come to support Cassian gathered around to offer congratulations and discuss the implications of the day's events. "You did good, Mrs. Holt," Thomas Brennan said, his weathered face creased with admiration. "Never seen a woman handle legal testimony like that. You showed them city lawyers what frontier intelligence looks like." The praise from the community patriarch meant more than Mariah had expected. These were her neighbors now, her people, and their acceptance mattered in ways that went beyond mere social courtesy. But it was the look in Cassian's eyes that truly mattered. As the crowd thinned and they found themselves alone in the courthouse, he pulled her into his arms with the desperate relief of a man who had just realized how close he had come to losing everything. "You were magnificent," he whispered against her hair. "Watching you stand up to Steele, watching you present that testimony, I've never been prouder of anything in my life." "We won," she said, the reality of their victory finally sinking in. "We actually won. We did more than win. We proved that we belong together, that we make each other stronger." Cassian pulled back to look at her face, his expression serious despite their triumph. "Mariah, I need to tell you something." Before he could continue, she placed her finger against his lips. "I know what you're going to say, and my answer is yes." "You don't know what I was going to ask. You were going to ask if I wanted to stay married to you by choice instead of necessity. If I wanted to build a real life together, with real love and real partnership." She smiled, the expression transforming her face with joy. "The answer is yes, Cassian. Yes to all of it." Cassian's response was to kiss her with the passion and tenderness of a man who had finally learned the difference between taking what he wanted and accepting what was freely given. When they broke apart, he reached into his vest pocket and produced the wedding ring set. "I had these made for us," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Real rings for a real marriage." The bands were simple but beautiful, made from gold, and engraved with intertwined vines that echoed the pattern on the wooden comb he had carved for her. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Mariah felt the last piece of their complicated courtship fall into place. "I love you, Cassian Holt," she said, the words carrying all the weight of choice and commitment that had been missing from their original vows. "I love you too, Mariah Holt, and I promise you 3 things: respect, partnership, and all the children we can love and raise together." 3 strong boys?" she asked with gentle teasing. 3 strong children, whatever combination God sees fit to bless us with. Boys or girls, they'll be raised with love instead of just legacy. As they walked out of the courthouse hand in hand, Mariah felt the kind of completion that came from surviving trials and emerging stronger. They had defended their home against legal assault, faced down threats of violence, and most importantly, chosen each other freely after learning who they truly were beneath their careful masks. The ranch that awaited them was more than property, no, it was the foundation of a family built on love and mutual respect rather than necessity and convenience. Whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them as true partners, equals in every sense that mattered. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson as they rode toward home, toward the life they had chosen to build together. Behind them lay the dangers and deceptions of Marcus Steele's schemes. Ahead lay the promise of tomorrow, and all the tomorrows after that, rich with possibility and bright with hope. The wooden toy horse was small enough to fit in Cassian's large palm, its surfaces smooth from careful sanding and polished to a warm glow that caught the firelight. He had been working on it for weeks in his workshop, carving the details with the same patient precision he brought to all his crafts. The miniature mane flowed like real hair, the legs were positioned in a perfect gallop, and the expression somehow captured the spirit of freedom that defined the frontier horses he knew so well. 6 months had passed since the courthouse victory that had secured their land and their future. Spring had come to Coyote Gulch with unusual abundance. The winter snows had been heavy, the spring rains generous, and the grass in their pastures grew thick and green under the warming sun. It was the kind of season that reminded settlers why they had come west in the first place, when the land showed its promise instead of its perils. But for Mariah and Cassian, the true abundance of the season wasn't measured in rainfall or grass growth. It was measured in the gradual swell of Mariah's belly and the way her hand curved protectively over their growing child. "Boy or girl? What do you think?" Cassian asked, holding up the finished toy horse for her inspection. Mariah looked up from her sewing tiny clothes that seemed impossibly small for human habitation and smiled with the contentment of a woman who had found her place in the world. At 22, she carried pregnancy with the same grace she had brought to every other challenge in her life. The morning sickness had passed, replaced by an energy and vitality that made her glow with health and happiness. "Either way, they'll love it," she said, reaching out to trace the horse's carved mane with her finger. "You've given it such character, I can almost see it running across the prairie." The months since their courtroom triumph had transformed their relationship from partnership born of necessity into a love story that had surprised them both with its depth and strength. Marcus Steele had disappeared from the territory shortly after his legal defeat, taking his hired guns and his schemes with him. Rumors suggested he had moved on to Colorado, where territorial law was even more chaotic and opportunities for fraudulent land grabs more abundant. His departure had brought peace to the valley, but more importantly, it had given Cassian and Mariah the time and space to discover what their marriage could become when it was based on choice rather than survival. They had learned each other's rhythms and preferences, had developed the kind of easy intimacy that made conversation unnecessary but never unwelcome. "I've been thinking," Mariah said, setting down her sewing to give him her full attention, "about names." "Oh?" Cassian moved closer, settling into the chair beside hers with the careful movements of a man conscious of his wife's condition. "And what conclusions have you reached?" "If it's a boy, I'd like to name him after your father. James, wasn't it?" The suggestion clearly surprised and moved him. Cassian's relationship with his father's memory had been complicated by grief and disappointment, but the months with Mariah had helped him separate the man from his failures. "James Cassian Holt," he said slowly, testing the sound of it. "I like that. And if it's a girl?" "Elizabeth Mariah Holt," Cassian replied without hesitation, "after my mother and the woman who saved us both." The names carried the weight of family history and hope for the future, connecting their child to the legacy of love that had finally taken root in the Holt house. As they sat together in the lamplight, Mariah felt the baby move within her, a flutter of life that reminded her of all the dreams she had thought lost in the ashes of her childhood home. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Marrying me instead of finding someone who could guarantee you sons?" Cassian's answer was to reach for her hand, his thumb tracing the gold band that had replaced the borrowed ring from their hasty wedding. "I regret wasting so much time thinking that love was weakness. I regret not seeing your strength from the beginning, but marrying you? Never. Even if this baby is a girl, even if all our children are daughters. Especially then," his voice carried absolute conviction, "our daughters will inherit this ranch and run it better than any sons could. They'll be educated, strong, capable of anything they set their minds to, just like their mother." The transformation in his thinking had been gradual but complete. The man who had once demanded sons to carry on his name now understood that legacy was about more than bloodline. It was about values, character, and the kind of love that could survive any trial. A knock at the front door interrupted their peaceful evening. Cassian rose to answer it, hand moving automatically to his gun belt, despite the calmer times they now enjoyed. Old habits of vigilance died hard on the frontier. But the visitor was Thomas Brennan, bearing news that brought smiles to both their faces. "Thought you'd want to know," the older rancher said, accepting the cup of coffee Mariah offered despite the late hour. "Got word from the territorial capital. Marcus Steele's been arrested in Colorado, seems. He tried the same land fraud scheme down there and picked the wrong target. Federal marshals are involved now." "Good," Cassian said with satisfaction. "Maybe that will discourage others from trying similar schemes." "Already has, from what I hear. Your wife's testimony at the hearing has become something of a legend. Lawyers and judges all over the territory are talking about the importance of proper document authentication." Brennan's weathered face creased with pride. "Valley's got itself quite a reputation now for standing up to corruption." The news was satisfying not just for its justice, but for what it represented. Their victory had become part of the larger story of honest settlers standing against those who would steal what others had built through honest work. It was the kind of legacy that mattered more than individual wealth or fame. After Brennan left, Cassian and Mariah settled into their nighttime routine with the comfortable familiarity of couple who had learned to move together like dancers following music only they could hear. As Mariah brushed her hair with the wooden comb he had made her, Cassian read aloud from the newspaper that had arrived that week on the stage from Cheyenne. "Says here the territorial legislature is considering new requirements for document authentication in land disputes," he reported. "Going to require expert verification for any claim involving property transfers from before 1850. Because of our case?" "Partly. Seems our Professor Morrison has been busy spreading the word about proper historical analysis." The knowledge that their struggle had contributed to broader improvements in territorial law added another layer of satisfaction to their victory. They had fought not just for themselves, but for every honest settler who might face similar challenges in the future. As they prepared for bed, Mariah caught sight of herself in the mirror and marveled at the changes 6 months had brought. The hollow-cheeked desperation of the woman who had stumbled onto the Holt Ranch seeking work had been replaced by the glowing health of a woman who had found her place in the world. Her education was no longer a secret to be hidden, but a tool to be used for the benefit of her family and community. Most importantly, the careful emotional distance she had maintained as protection against heartbreak had given way to the kind of deep, abiding love that made every day an adventure worth sharing. "What are you thinking about?" Cassian asked, following her gaze to the mirror. About how much can change in half a year, she replied. 6 months ago, I was a desperate girl with nothing but the clothes on my back. Now I'm Mrs. Cassian Holt, with a home, a husband who loves me, and a baby on the way. Now you're the woman who saved my ranch, reformed my character, and taught me that strength comes from partnership rather than domination. Cassian corrected gently. I was the lucky one in this arrangement. As they settled into bed, Mariah placed Cassian's hand on her belly so he could feel their child's movements. The baby was active tonight, perhaps responding to the warmth and contentment that filled the house like good music. 3 strong boys, she said with gentle teasing, remembering his original demand. 3 strong children, raised with love and respect for each other and their heritage, he corrected, and maybe a few more after that if we're blessed. A few more? I find I have a taste for family life, Cassian admitted, his hand moving in gentle circles on her belly. Something I never expected to discover. Outside their window, the sounds of the ranch settling into sleep provided a familiar lullaby, cattle lowing softly in the distance, horses moving peacefully in the corrals, the night birds calling across the prairie. It was the soundtrack of a life they had built together from nothing but determination and growing love. As sleep began to claim them, Mariah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had walked across 3 states, seeking survival, and had found love instead. She had accepted marriage as a practical arrangement, and had discovered partnership that challenged and strengthened them both. She had hidden her intelligence as protection, and had learned that the right man would see it as a gift rather than a threat. The wooden toy horse sat on the table beside their bed, waiting for small hands to bring it to life. Soon there would be other toys, other projects, other challenges and joys that came with raising children on the frontier. But whatever the future brought, they would face it together, Cassian and Mariah Holt, partners in every sense that mattered. In the morning, they would rise to tend their cattle and manage their household, to build their empire not through domination but through love and mutual respect. They would teach their children that strength came from character rather than force, that intelligence was a gift to be shared rather than hidden, and that love was the foundation upon which everything worthwhile was built. The ranch house that had once echoed with emptiness now rang with laughter and conversation, with the sound of a woman humming as she worked, and a man whistling as he carved toys for the child they would soon welcome. It was the sound of a home where love had taken root and flourished, despite the harsh frontier soil. Sometimes the most broken people did indeed find each other in the most desperate places. And sometimes, if they were very lucky and very brave, they discovered that love was not the weakness they had feared, but the strength they had been seeking all along. In the heart of Coyote Gulch, where dust still choked dreams and survival still favored the ruthless, Cassian and Mariah Holt had proven that some things were stronger than fear, more enduring than hardship, and more valuable than all the land and cattle in the territory. They had each other, they had their growing family, and they had the rest of their lives to discover just how much joy 2 hearts could hold when they finally learned to beat as one.